So we're studying Golden Doves. We're on page 71, and Ferdinand de Saussure, his theory of language was that words are completely arbitrary, which is to say, let's say the word glass, referring to the actual glass, is an arbitrary symbol, right? And that's the theory of Ferdinand de Saussure, and we believe in it. We believe in the arbitrariness of language, but there's a certain subtlety in the question of arbitrariness, which we're going to be studying today. So we're on page 71 of the Golden Doves. Right. Language is conventional in the sense that all hierarchical systems and organizations are necessarily artificial and therefore admit an alternative system. Right? As your salad. Notice, he didn't say that language is arbitrary. Shtar said language is conventional. Meaning, the reason this is called, for example, a cigar, it's because everybody refers to it as a cigar, so we recognize it as a cigar. It's a little different than saying that it's arbitrary, right? We're going to see what that means. Now, all hierarchical systems are conventional, meaning they're not arbitrary. For example, you have a hierarchical system. You have a king, you have a president, and you have a vice president, and you have the Senate, and you have the Congress. That's a convention, but it's not arbitrary. It's a convention in the sense that you could have the British system where you have a king, and you have a queen, and you have a parliament. So there's a difference between saying it's completely arbitrary. It's not completely arbitrary, but every hierarchic system by its nature is conventional. That's a little different. You understand the idea? All right. There is, on the one hand, a necessary and absolute relationship between a word and what it represents. Let me explain what that means. If the word glass didn't refer absolutely to this glass, then the word wouldn't work. So it is an absolute relationship between the symbol, the word, and that which the word symbolizes, the object, let's say. Right? Maimonides considered the word, and whatever man called it, that was its name. Right? So look what it says. Yeah. The Hayot. Oh, Hushemo. I'm sorry. Thank you. And whatever man, you can check it on your phone if you got a chance. Right. Check what it was. Hushemo. Bechol asher yikra lo ha'adam. Hushemo. Right. All right. You'll find it.
Nefesh Haya Hushemo.
Hushemo. Okay. A proof that according to scripture, language is conventional. So how is language conventional? What makes the name of the Aryeh an Aryeh is that Adam called it an Aryeh. So as long as Adam and everybody else calls it an Aryeh, that's what makes it an Aryeh. Right? So it's conventional, and it's there's an absolute relation between the word Aryeh and the Aryeh. Right? We must point out that Maimonides accepted the tradition that God taught speech to man. Now, who taught man how to speak? So there's a masorah that Hashem taught man how to speak. So he's saying if Hashem taught man how to speak, then there is zero arbitrariness to language. That's what you would say. However, he distinguished between the general faculty of speech, which is God-given, and the actual languages themselves with their respective linguistic systems, which are artificial. So on the one hand, the ability of man to speak, the linguistic intelligence, that's from God. But just because God gave man linguistic intelligence doesn't mean that God told man what is the correct word to use for any particular object. You understand that point?
Does it have to do with Saussure's Langen Parole?
Yeah, well, why? How do you associate with that Langen Parole?
With the language. And you have the speech. In other words, that's one of the locations in which he delineates the difference between language and speech. No?
Right.
Maybe I don't remember correctly.
Right, no, but language pearl is something a little different. I see what you say. Oh, I understand what you're saying. Interesting. There's a general system of linguistics, and there's the actual usage of word. Interesting. That's an interesting point. All right, let's continue. Maimonides' proof from scripture is predicated upon three closely interpretations. First, it was Adam and not God who instituted speech. That's number one. Adam was the one who first spoke. Right. Number two, the expression and whatever called asher yikra lo ha'adam, whatever man called it, is taken as indicative of the arbitrariness of the word itself. So there is a certain arbitrary aspect to language. As Ferdinand de Saussure says, maybe instead of calling it Ariyah, they could have called it Kos, right? Or they could have called it Ariyah Shulchan, maybe. So there's a certain arbitrariness. That's Ferdinand de Saussure. And finally, the second half of the verse, and that was its name, Hu Shemo, is understood to mean that that became its name, meaning Hu Shemo means the name became what Adam called it. It's not that the name was that and therefore Adam called it, but Hu Shemo because Adam called it that. You understand? So again, this follows Ferdinand de Saussure very nicely, positing thus a basic linguistic property whereby a sign is necessarily associated with what it represents. So after the fact, the word Ariyah necessarily represents an Ariyah. If an Ariyah was to represent Mayim and Shulchan, maybe, and an Ariyah, then it wouldn't be a word, right? So there must be a necessary absolute relationship. On the other hand, this necessary relationship is effective only within a given linguistic system, right? Because of course you can have another linguistic system. Instead of Ariyah, you call it wine, right? And any word can be replaced by a linguistic equivalent from another language, right? So each language has its own system. Within the language, words are absolute. But there are different languages. That's Babel, right? Thus, the validity of a linguistic sign is necessary within a given linguistic system, but conventional from the point of view of the totality of linguistic systems. So, if you look at that linguistic system, kos necessarily means cup. That's it. Once the kos means cup, that's the meaning of cup, or that's the meaning of kos, right? But if you look at the different linguistic systems and you see there's a certain conventionality, in Ireland they call it this, in France they call it that, in Hebrew, in Israel they call it that. So there's a certain arbitrariness to language, but there's also a certain conventionality to language, right? Okay, I think that's enough for purposes of our study, and we will. I'm not going to picture you because you're eating. In Israel, by the way, having a great time. Hope everybody else is enjoying themselves as well. And studying Golden Doves with some of my favorite Talmidim, my son on the one hand, my son on the other hand, and Ike is not with us.